So I recently watched Federico Fellini's La Dolce Vita from 1960. Federico Fellini wrote and directed this film, and while I have some comments on it that aren't too great, it more had me thinking about something I'd been wishing to discuss for some time as to the length of films and the slowness of certain films and how long films can be fast-paced and how long films can be slowly paced. I think I mentioned I watched 8.5 in one of my other reviews. While I really enjoyed it for the most part, I didn't really feel like there was a huge amount I could discuss about it because it's quite heavily analysed. It's really, really famous. But an issue I had with it was that the first half of the film was very kind of slow, meandering, and while that can be good in some cases, like I'd say a Bela Tarr film, and I'll mention that later, it really was just kind of a bit all over the place. While I'm saying this, it wasn't terrible in any respect. It's very, very nicely shot, very nicely acted, very nicely scored, and quite interesting, but it's still kind of like, okay, where is this going? I'm a little, confused, but it totally redeemed itself for that. It totally made up for it in the second part, which was beautiful. It kind of tied all of it together in this kind of very weird, dreamy, kind of nightmare-y dreamscape way, and that's really, really interesting, and I really enjoyed it after that point because it was like, oh, it all makes sense now, it's all very fleshed out. And I went into La Dolce Vita with similar expectations. 8.5 is only like 90 minutes long, I think. La Dolce Vita is 3 hours, so I was like, okay, I'm interested to see how he does pacing here. And for the most part, for La Dolce Vita, while it was quite slow in the beginning, it does kind of pick up. There are these really interesting themes about like the paparazzi and how they kind of invade people's lives and, media ethics and that sort of thing. But that's like totally in the background, and that's great. It's never really spoken or even mentioned directly by the characters. It's just because the main characters are celebrities or they're kind of well known enough in Italy and they're just chased around by the paparazzi constantly. And so there's this interesting aspect to that. But then the film just kind of falls apart, and it's really slow and incredibly dull. Like that's it. It's just boring. It's just really boring. Nothing really happens in the second half. It sets it up. There's this really fantastic scene, an absolutely wonderful scene where I guess it's kind of discussing the destruction of like sacrosanctity, where these Italian children had apparently seen the Madonna under this olive tree, and so everyone's gathering there because they're trying to see the Madonna again, and the children are going to try, summon her again, and then eventually they don't, and there's this huge riot, and everyone kind of runs in and is trying to like tear pieces off the tree because it's apparently, this sacred tree, and in the process, one of the children actually gets killed from being trampled on, I guess. But it's just, everyone's, very peaceful and waiting tentatively for some, Christ-like figure to show up, and then they just tear this tree apart, and that's like a really wonderful sequence. Essentially, it's a pretty basic character drama, love story. The main character, who was also the main character in 8.5, starts to fall for this, very, very famous American movie star while his wife is at home, and lots of these different character interactions, but then the second half just, like, forgets about that. Like, it just isn't in the film. And then the film just does other things, and then it ends. It's just... I was so confused, like, the film has themes of overindulgence, but that doesn't mean it has to translate physically onto the film. Like, just because the film is about overindulgence partially, it doesn't mean that the film itself should be overindulgent in itself. Like, it doesn't have to be fucking 3 hours long. That's really the issue I had. I mean, really, it was kind of a problem for the movie itself, in that just being invested in the characters' actions isn't really enough. Like, the plot is just really all over the place, and I felt that a bit in 8.5, but it tied it together with all these visual themes, and there was a very, very solid ending to the film, and it all kind of, worked out neatly, even if it wasn't so neatly for the characters. But yeah, La Dolce Vita is just all over the place, really slow and meandering. Like, I had a really fucking hard time getting to the end of this. Like, I don't often get super bored in films. You have long films that can be, you're watching them for extended periods of time, and there's the fatigue element in that you're like, okay, I've been watching this for, 6 hours now, in the case of if you're doing like a Lord of the Rings marathon, say, but it isn't really the same. So here's kind of what I wanted to discuss with that, in that sometimes you have very, very long films which have decent to fast pacing and they can feel totally fine. But what I find a little pretentious is when people make long, slow films for the sake of it being a long, slow film. I'm sure Fellini didn't really make this with that intent, but I've seen a few slow films that are just slow. And slow is good in certain cases, but it generally has to fit in with, the atmosphere of the film, and it's really distracting and really odd where characters talk briefly and then the film just kind of stretches on, and it just kind of reveals that essentially you have very, very little substance. And don't get me wrong, this isn't me having a short attention span or anything. There are very, very long films I've watched. I'll say Bellatar's Sudden Tango, which is roughly 8 hours long. Sudden Tango is a film where the content is so dense visually. It's incredibly, incredibly slow. Like, I've never seen a film that slow. For example, the opening shot is a 15-minute uncut shot of cows walking through a village, but it's so beautifully shot, technically incredible, and it just looks absolutely amazing in how they actually did the shot and how slow it's done, and that's incredible. And while it meanders in parts, you often have time as a viewer to kind of appreciate the visual acuity, or certain shots are incredibly long and there are very, very long conversations with characters. Say in Werkmeister Harmonies, there's a shot where characters begin talking at one location and then they walk for about 4 minutes to another location with the camera, tailing them behind the entire time, and sometimes they speak, and it's just so natural but so beautifully shot. That's a film that uses all 8 hours to this, perfect extent. You just have absolutely beautiful visuals to keep the audience interested, but it also uses the lengthiness to kind of have this incredibly, eerie, kind of Kafka-esque feeling to it. But it gets away with being really, really slow because it has beautiful visuals and it's incredibly interesting and it fits with the atmosphere, so that's totally fine. It's the longest film I've ever seen, but I was not bored for one instant during it because it's just incredibly, incredibly interesting to watch. Same with something like Fanny and Alexander, though. I think they can get away with it a bit more because it's kind of like 1 to 2 hour arcs for the different episodes, but even so, that's 5 hours long, and it is quite slow in parts, and it's mainly dialogue. But the dialogue is incredibly interesting, it's shot beautifully, like I've said for however many minutes in my other review, which you can find here. It's really when a film has minimal substance, no visual niceties to look at, it's just a plain shot, which is fine, but when you're having a very, very slow film, it doesn't really work to have it shot just normally. Like, if you're gonna have something very slow, you should really work with, better camera technique, better lighting, better, looking shots, so that, the audience has more time to absorb it. Now, don't get me wrong, I probably prefer a slower film to a really, really fast-paced, ridiculous film, because I'd prefer a film to take its time with things and, be spread out over a longer period of time so you can fully absorb the experience compared to something being bam, 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 1,000 cuts a minute. But in reality, if you have little substance in a very, very fast cut film, you're going to have very, very little substance if you stretch it out to a really, really long period of time. And I feel like longer films can get away with that a bit more often because they're often seen as being more clever for being longer, or simply because of their length, they're able to just kind of get away with being a slow film, you just have to appreciate it. But that's not really the case when there's just nothing to appreciate and it's just doing that to be a wanky, pretentious piece of shit. That's not to say that La Dolce Vita is a wanky, pretentious piece of shit. It just kind of sparked my interest again in that kind of conversation, in that while it is incredibly interesting in certain parts, and I really, really would have liked to see more of the, paparazzi, media, value themes, and destruction of sacrosanctity, they're never really given closure in the story, and by closure I mean they're just never really mentioned again. They're just there for the sake of it, and they don't really have anything to do with the story. Like, it's just kind of okay. So yeah, I was a little bit disappointed with it. Wrapping back around to discussing La Dolce Vita, it was shot beautifully in some parts. There were some very, very neat shots, not as incredible as 8.5, but Fellini obviously knows what he's doing, and he's a very competent filmmaker. I just feel like this is like a very definitive stumble. There were certain points in the film where I was kind of like, oh, okay, this is doing the 8.5 thing. The first part is a bit slow, and the second half will kind of tie it all back in together, but then it ended up being like the reverse. Like, the first half was the good part, and the second half was kind of the shit part. So all over the place, and you know what, it doesn't get saved to being a long film. If you have nothing to say and your film is long, you don't get excused for your film being long and slow. Like, it just doesn't work like that, even though some people probably see it like that because they instantly associate long, slow, black and white with quality. The truth is that obviously not all old films are good. Not all slow black and white films are good. Films used to be very, very slow. Generally, things have picked up the pace further on as we have shorter attention spans and the information is, you know, more available to us, and also just stylistically, films have gotten quicker, as well as, you know, technological things, we're able to edit faster and all that sort of thing. But just because you're doing something in the style of something doesn't mean it's automatically good because you're doing it in that style. Like, it just doesn't work like that. There are plenty of really, really shit old films, and there are plenty of really shit new films. That's my 3 pence on the issue. I was also sadly disappointed with Dolce, Vita, but I'd be interested to see what other people think about slow films. I've seen a fair few of them, and for the most part I enjoy them because they're really, really good quality, but sometimes you just come across a few that are just... there's just nothing there, and I feel like I want to objectively analyze things and not just give leeway to something because other people say it should be good or society says that it should be good. Like, I just don't think things should get away with it like that. Say, for example, I have always detested modern art. Jackson Pollock never did it for me. I don't ever see the skill involved in splashing paint on a canvas. While it may look nice aesthetically, it is in no way compared to the skill required by the Renaissance artists or even postmodernist artists. Like, in no way. And really, it's just kind of a cheap way to get out of actually having to learn an incredibly difficult skill. So yeah, tell me what you think about either of those things. If you liked La Dolce Vita, if you didn't, what you think of other Fellini films, what you think of longer films and how they should be paced, if they should be fast-paced but long films, or if they should be slow-paced but short films, you know, how that works, and thus... farewell.
Universal, like all I do.